Imagine standing at the edge of a frozen world 40,000 years ago. The wind cuts through pine forests that stretch to the horizon. Snow falls in silence, and somewhere in the shadows between the trees, something watches you. It has a face, almost like yours, eyes that hold something ancient and knowing, hands that have carved bone, shaped fire, and buried their dead with flowers. But it is not you. It is not Homo sapiens. It is something else, something that lived alongside your ancestors for tens of thousands of years, hunted the same animals, sheltered in the same caves, perhaps even looked up at the same stars and wondered. And then, one day, it was simply gone. No final battle, no great catastrophe recorded in stone, no monument, no grave, no farewell, just silence. This is the story of the Neanderthals, the most misunderstood species in human history. A people so close to us that their DNA still runs in your blood right now, and yet a people the world forgot for nearly 200,000 years. The question that haunted scientists, philosophers, and storytellers for over a century is not just what happened to them, it's whether we did. Let's go back, way back, not to the dramatic age of Rome, not to the pyramids, not even to the first cities of Mesopotamia. We're going back to a world before all of that. A world before writing, before agriculture, before the idea of civilization had ever crossed a human mind. It is roughly 400,000 years ago. Europe is vast, cold, and largely empty of people, at least people like us. But it is not empty. Scattered across what will one day become Spain, France, Germany, and the Levant, a species is quietly thriving. They are stocky and powerful, built for a brutal climate. Barrel chests, thick brow ridges, wide noses designed to warm freezing air before it reaches the lungs. Evolution has sculpted them for ice and endurance. We call them Neanderthals, named after the Neander Valley in Germany where their remains were first discovered in 1856. But that name and everything it came to mean would haunt them for over 150 years. Because when their bones were pulled from that limestone cave in the 19th century, the scientists who examined them did not see a close relative. They saw a beast. The original descriptions of Neanderthals, published in an era shaped by colonial hierarchies and rigid ideas about human progress, painted them as primitive brutes. The caveman stereotype was born, and it stuck with devastating persistence. For generations, children learned that Neanderthals were a failed experiment, a dead end, a crude sketch before evolution finally got it right and produced us. That story, it turns out, was almost entirely wrong.
Here's what the science now tells us, and it is far more extraordinary than the myth. Neanderthals had brains that were, on average, larger than ours. Not wired the same way, the architecture was different, but bigger in total volume. They were not shuffling grunters, but sophisticated hunters who worked in coordinated groups to take down woolly mammoths, cave bears, and giant deer in some of the harshest landscapes on Earth. They made tools, not crude rocks bashed together, but carefully shaped instruments crafted using a technique called levallois, a multi-step process that required planning, memory, and the ability to hold a mental image of the finished tool before the work even began. They controlled fire, they cooked food, they built shelters, but it gets deeper than survival. In a cave in Shanidar, in what is now northern Iraq, archaeologists discovered a Neanderthal burial where the body had been laid with deliberate care, and surrounding the remains were traces of pollen from multiple flowering plants. Some researchers believe those flowers were placed there intentionally. A burial, a farewell, a gesture that whispers of grief, of ritual, of something we might dare to call spirituality. In Spain's Cueva de los Aviones, researchers found pierced shells and mineral pigments, materials used for personal ornamentation, possibly body paint, possibly jewelry, dated to over 115,000 years ago. That's before Homo sapiens even arrived in Europe. And in a cave in France, deep underground where no natural light reaches, someone went to extraordinary lengths to arrange broken stalagmites into deliberate circular structures. The hands that built them? Neanderthal. The date? 176,000 years ago. These are not the actions of brutes. These are the actions of beings who felt something about their world, who wanted to mark it, decorate it, mourn within it. So why did they vanish?
This is where the story shifts. Around 70,000 years ago, Homo sapiens, modern humans like you and me, began moving out of Africa in larger numbers. We crossed into the Middle East, crept through Central Asia, and eventually, somewhere between 45,000 and 43,000 years ago, we entered Europe for the first time. Neanderthal territory. For thousands of years, the two species coexisted on the same continent. There is evidence they sometimes shared the same cave systems, ate the same prey, made similar tools, and, here is the part that makes the hair stand up on the back of your neck, there is evidence they sometimes did far more than coexist. They interbred. In 2010, geneticist Svante Pääbo and his team at the Max Planck Institute achieved something that would have seemed like science fiction just decades earlier. They sequenced the Neanderthal genome from a finger bone found in Siberia, and they discovered that between 1% and 4% of the DNA in people of non-African descent today comes directly from Neanderthals. Think about that for a moment. You are, in a very real and measurable sense, part Neanderthal. Their genes survive in us, influencing our immune systems, our metabolism, perhaps even aspects of how we think. The species that vanished never fully disappeared. They merged. They dissolved slowly into us. But genes alone don't explain a disappearance. Something happened to the Neanderthal population that was catastrophic enough to end their independent existence, and for decades, the leading suspect was us. The pattern is stark. Wherever modern humans arrive, megafauna disappears. Mammals that survived millions of ice ages and climate shifts simply cease to exist within a few thousand years of human contact. In Australia, the giant wombats vanish. In the Americas, the mammoths disappear. And in Europe, just as modern humans arrive in numbers, the Neanderthals go quiet. Did we hunt them? Did we carry diseases they had no immunity to, the way European colonizers devastated indigenous populations in the Americas thousands of years later? Did we simply outcompete them, using our networks, our language, our slightly different cognitive abilities to absorb every resource they needed? Or did we interbreed with them so persistently and so thoroughly that they were not killed, but absorbed, genetically swallowed into our expanding population until the last purely Neanderthal individual lived and died without another of their kind in the world? The honest answer is, we don't know for certain, and that uncertainty is part of what makes this story so haunting. What we do know is this. Around 40,000 years ago, the archaeological signature of Neanderthals, their tools, their hearths, their bones, simply stops appearing in the record. The last known Neanderthal populations clung on in the caves of southern Spain and the southern tip of Gibraltar, places where the climate was slightly warmer, where modern humans were slower to arrive. They held on there in small, dwindling groups for perhaps another few thousand years. Imagine that last community. A group of beings with hundreds of thousands of ancestral memory, knowledge of the land, of the seasons, of which plants heal, and which rocks hold fire, facing a world that was changing around them in ways they could not have understood. And then, silence. But before we cast ourselves as villains in this story, consider one more layer. The Neanderthals were not the only other human species on Earth during this period.
While modern humans were spreading through Europe and the Middle East, there existed in Siberia and East Asia another branch of humanity, the Denisovans, known only from a few fragments of bone and teeth, yet genetically distinct enough to constitute a separate species entirely. Their DNA survives today in the genomes of people from Papua New Guinea, Aboriginal Australians, and parts of Southeast Asia. And in the jungles of Flores, a tiny island in Indonesia, a species called Homo floresiensis, nicknamed the Hobbit for its 3-foot stature, was living, tool-making, and hunting pygmy elephants as recently as 50,000 years ago. On the island of Luzon in the Philippines, another species, Homo luzonensis, was there too. Small, distinct, gone.
In the Kalau cave on that same island, their teeth and bones suggest a creature so unusual that paleoanthropologists are still debating how it fits into our family tree. What this tells us is staggering. For most of human history, for hundreds of thousands of years, the Earth was not home to one kind of human. It was home to many, a whole ecosystem of intelligent, tool-using, fire-building, feeling beings, each adapted to their own corner of the world. We are the last survivors of what was once a crowded family, and we may never fully understand why. There's a moment described by paleoanthropologist Johannes Krauss that captures something essential about all of this. When his team was working on ancient DNA extracted from a Denisovan finger bone, just a sliver of ancient material, and the genome came together, he described looking at the sequence and realizing he was reading the biography of a person, an individual who had lived and breathed and died somewhere in a cold Siberian cave, perhaps 50,000 years ago. A person so different from us that they barely had a name, yet so similar that their genes still whisper in human bodies living today. That is what we are really talking about when we talk about vanished species. Not categories, not evolutionary diagrams, people. Beings who sat by fires and told stories, because why would they not? Beings who touched the foreheads of their dying, who looked at the night sky and perhaps felt something wordless and enormous at the sight of the stars. We share this planet's history with them. In some deep and molecular sense, we share ourselves with them. So here is the question this history leaves us with. In a world where we are the only human species left, where every other branch of our extraordinary family has gone dark, what does that say about us? Are we the survivors? The victors? The inheritors of something that was taken or lost or transformed beyond recognition? Or are we something stranger still, a species that carries the traces of all those lost others within us, a living archive of a world that no longer exists, walking around with Neanderthal immune genes helping us fight off viruses, Denisovan adaptations helping high-altitude populations breathe thin mountain air? Perhaps the Neanderthals did not vanish without a trace. Perhaps the trace is you. Every person of non-African descent carries a fragment of a species that shaped spears, painted shells, arranged flowers in the dark, and stared at the same moon we stare at tonight. They are gone, yes, but not entirely. Never entirely. And the next time you look in the mirror, really look, consider the possibility that what stares back is not purely Homo sapiens. It is also something older, something that survived an ice age, something that buried its dead and decorated its body and sat in firelight in a world that was cold and vast and beautiful and terrifying. Something that was almost us, something that in the end became part of us.